So now we're going to talk about some key questions to ask and mistakes to avoid when evaluating qualitative research. This is more collective. We've talked about some of these throughout the module, but this is going to give you a really focused sense of a way to really examine how to evaluate qualitative research. All right. So some key questions that you're going to want to ask when you read any sort of article that has qualitative research. 1, are the research questions appropriate for the qualitative methods? So if the person who's doing the research wants to know how many people experience cancer disparities, you're not going to get that from qualitative research. That's a quantitative research question. So you want to make sure that the research method matches the question. And we talked a little bit about the types of questions in the earlier part of the module, and we also talked a little bit about them throughout. So that'll help you get a better sense of how to evaluate qualitative research overall. 2, can the research questions be answered through the qualitative methods used? So if you want to get an in-depth analysis about how someone might be experiencing cancer disparities as it pertains to interactions with other people, or maybe you want to get a better sense of how group dynamics are influencing how people perceive cancer disparities or their own experience of cancer, focus groups would be a really good example. You may not be able to get that information from mere observation. However, if you really want to know what people are actually doing versus what they're saying they're doing, ethnography and observation is a really good method for that. If you're really interested in how people understand their experiences across like their life course, essentially, or why they are experiencing discrimination based on various aspects about their life, narrative research might be really helpful for that. Anyway, so you want to make sure that you are using the right methods for the research questions that, and when I say you want to make sure that that the researcher is using the right methods so that you're able to understand what they're saying based on the methods that they're using. So that's a way that you can evaluate qualitative research. Another way, a third way in which you can evaluate qualitative research is the sample of study participants appropriate to answer the research question? So for example, you wouldn't want to review a research or a study that just looks at only white college students but is interested in race relations in a particular community is really not a research article that's very helpful for you. And so that suggests that that research design may be flawed. Another question you want to consider is, does the researcher provide evidence of self-reflection and reflexivity? So qualitative research, especially generally qualitative research overall, there are moments where the researcher is really engaging in interpretation of another person's information, specifically in-depth responses through interviews or watching a phenomenon unfold. And a researcher is bringing his or her own experiences to that interpretation. So good qualitative research tends to have at least some sort of blurb about where the researcher is reflecting on their own experiences and how that shaped the research itself. Not all qualitative research does that, and it's not mandatory, but that is certainly an indicator that the researcher has reflected on that and how it has shaped their own research. So a fifth question that you want to look at is, has the researcher engaged in ethical data collection and analysis? And that's really important with qualitative. It's important with research overall, but with qualitative research, it surfaces, especially when you have research that investigates issues that are particularly sensitive. Now, one thing you'll want to know is that researchers, in order to get the research approved, you have to go through an ethics board and they have to approve the research. So generally, it's been stamped as ethical by an ethics board, and often these ethics boards are very challenging to, there are lots of rigorous evaluations to make sure that one's research is ethical. So that's a really good thing. But it's still important to give that a second look, especially as a social worker, where social work, social justice is one of our missions. You want to make sure that the researcher has engaged in ethical data collection. And if you're looking at research articles that are outside of social work especially, or there are some disciplines that are less rigorous in terms of looking at the ethics of data collection, or have different ideas of what that means. So you'll want to take a closer look at how the researcher has gathered data. Are they cognizant of, like, for example, if you're looking at discrimination and you have done the researcher has done it, looked at this through focus groups. Have they considered what happens when they've now introduced an idea of discrimination to this group or to these individuals, and then do they just let them leave? Do they have any sort of follow-up? Is there any sort of like final concluding question or something at the end of the interview that provides some space for the people who have participated in the interview or participated in the focus group to make sense of, wow, I now realize I have experienced discrimination in a way that I never experienced before, I never realized before. That makes me really unhappy, or that makes me really mad. So an ethical approach would be to do something to accommodate or to incorporate that into the research itself. So a final question to consider, and this is one of probably, this is not a comprehensive list, but a final question to consider is, how has the research engaged in culturally responsive data collection and analysis? So, for example, there are some communities that are very suspicious of data collection for a variety of reasons. They've been historically oppressed, they've been historically discriminated against, and data has been collected and used in ways that have been really problematic. So you want to make sure that the researcher is being really aware of that history and is sensitive to the needs of a particular community, and why there might be some extra steps that need to be taken if a particular community if they're engaging in a community that has experienced historical trauma. So those are questions you want to ask yourself when you're looking at research that uses qualitative methods in particular. So the last thing we're going to talk about are common mistakes to avoid when evaluating qualitative research. So the first thing is you want to avoid the trap of generalizability. So qualitative research, one of the limitations is that it does not provide the ability to generalize to a broader population. That's not the purpose of qualitative research. So if you're looking at a qualitatively based article, you can't expect that it's going to create data that is generalizable. So don't fall into that trap. Another important mistake to avoid is to remember the purpose, the analysis, and outcome of qualitative research. So do not assume that qualitative research has the same purpose, analysis process, and outcome as quantitative research. Remember those questions that we discussed in the beginning of this module. They're different for quantitative research. They're different for qualitative research. So, and the ways in which a researcher gets that information is different. So keep that in mind when you're looking at a qualitative article. And another piece of advice is, do not let the numbers guide you. So when you're looking at qualitative research, or you're looking at an article with qualitative research, you're going to notice that the numbers are different than a quantitative research design usually. So quantitative projects tend to have larger numbers of people that they're getting information from. And that's because they have a different purpose, different process. Qualitative research tends to be much more in-depth, and so it has much smaller sample sizes. And so you really want to look at, again, for qualitative research, data saturation. Is the researcher, does it seem like the researcher has interviewed enough people to get the information that they need about a particular concept or phenomenon or whatever it is that they're researching? So, for example, 50 interviews may be overkill, and one case study may be completely sufficient. So maybe looking at one hospital is sufficient to answer the question that the researcher wants to do, and they may not need to look at 4 different hospitals. So, try not to be suspicious of a qualitative research project that has smaller numbers than what you would expect in a quantitative research, because remember, different purposes, different analyses, and different outcomes. And so don't let the numbers guide you in assessing the quality of a qualitative project. You want to look more at the richness of the data. And that'll help you in your social work practice and deciding what information and how that information can be useful to you in your micro, macro, whether it be policy, whether it be working with an individual client in an intervention situation, or some other way that you might be practicing social work.